I'm so excited to have Paul Jarvis on this Learn from the Pros episode. Paul is the CEO of what is formerly known as Bateau, but Paul, go ahead and tell us what the name of your new company is.
Thanks for having me, Luke. Company's name is Clarent.
Clarent. And is that how you spell it?
Clarent. And
Okay.
the name, Bateau was kind of a hard name to pronounce. So the new name we picked, Clarent, is really about our mission of making data clear and bringing clarity to messy data in the senior living industry.
I love that. So just tell us a little bit about what Clarent does for senior living communities. I've started to see, I would see the Bateau name everywhere. And so I just got really curious, and I love just going to your website, and it's just all about, just seems to be all about making data very easy, because we everyone says they like to be a data person, but then sometimes in senior living it can be hard to try and pinpoint specific sources of data and everything you need to know with data. So just tell us about what you all really do.
Yeah. So we work exclusively with senior living owners and operators. And I think that's the first key thing, is our team are data experts, but also senior living industry veterans. So we're not trying to apply kind of data models from multifamily housing or skilled nursing to senior living. We only do senior living. So what we really do is we hook up the systems that senior living operators and owners use into a single source of truth. And specifically, we mainly look at your payroll, your CRM, your general ledger of financials, and your occupancy. So we pull all that data together, and then we've built out a library of 150 plus senior living specific KPIs. So everything from, different ways to calculate occupancy and census, to things about accounts receivable or clinical metrics, but going from like messy data to business concepts that make sense, that you can ask questions, like what's my controllable operating expenses at this community? And then we automate those into reports, which we can customize for the C-suite, for executive directors. They're really easy to use. They're simple. So it goes all the way from messy data in the source systems to KPIs to easy to use reports, which show up for you.
I think that's brilliant. And I think that's just so needed in senior living, because I mean, I've been in the industry 5 to 6 years now, and it seems like for a while there's just been kind of a lack of clear data. And everyone says they're data driven and they make decisions by data, but then when you really dig down into it, it seems like people just have a hard time trying to find the numbers they really should know and need to know. Because we're on calls with VPs of marketing, and it shocks sometimes, like how, like the data they don't know. And so I love that you all are focusing on just making it easy and pulling in all of these different sources. I mean, do you have any thoughts on why in senior living? And I mean, I think now the tide is kind of shifting a little bit to people are really buying into data and having data and knowing their data. But do you have any thoughts on why maybe it's kind of taken so long to get here, where you look at other industries and it's been there for a while?
Yeah, it's a great question. So prior to starting the company, I worked at a company called Palantir for 7 years, where I did big data analytics for the Fortune 500 and the US government. So I got to see kind of what the rest of the world looks like. And then when we started this business, senior housing, operators would always tell us, I have all of these different systems running in my communities, and none of them talk to each other. And part of the challenge is senior living is this hybrid, pretty complicated business of real estate, healthcare, and hospitality all rolled into one. And a lot of the systems that we use were not built for senior living. They were built for skilled nursing. They were built for multifamily housing. And so the concepts that a senior living operator needs to think about don't exist in these systems, or you have to do a little bit of calculation to get them. And then these systems don't talk to each other. So as an operator, you're left doing a lot of manual work, which would be like, export these numbers from over here, export these numbers from over here, try to get them to match up, and then do that every week or every month to be able to report on that. So I think that the big challenge has been the systems don't talk to each other, and the data models in those systems were not built for our industry. And that's why our approach has been hook up the systems, but really like build the, I like to say that like we're trying to write the book on what are the KPIs that a senior living operator needs to look at. And that's from talking to operators and saying, how do you measure your business? Like, let me see the reports that you use on a weekly basis with your RDOs, on a daily basis with your EDs, on a monthly basis with your investors. Like, how do you think about running your business? What are those building blocks? Where does that data come from? Okay, let's build this together as a system.
You all would sell a lot of copies of that book, no doubt.
That is like part of that's one of our plans for the rest of the year. Is like I would love to actually like the book exists as a library on our website. Happy to show it to people. Um, and I want to like print it out and start giving it out at conferences because we're updating it all the time. Like when people come up to us and they say, "Hey, here is a KPI that I want to measure." The awesome thing about working in one industry specifically is, firstly, we've probably heard it from someone else, but if it's a really good idea, we're like, let's add that. So I'll give you a specific example. An asset manager or a guy who works in asset management at an operator said, I want to be able to give you the square footage of all my buildings. And then I want to be able to divide my maintenance costs by the square footage of each building to stack rank properties on maintenance cost per square foot. It's like that makes a lot of sense. Like a much bigger building is going to have a higher maintenance cost than a much smaller building. And so to compare it just on the maintenance cost isn't apples to apples. So to normalize that, let's divide it by square foot. And he's explaining as like, that is such a good idea. It makes total sense. Let's add that to our library going forward.
That's a great idea. Yeah, that's really cool. As you were talking about bringing these different softwares together, one of my first thoughts is, I mean, we're not, bringing softwares together nearly in the way that you all are. But I mean, part of our product is we've got an internal calendar system that we've built that can connect to a marketing director's calendar, and so we've got to have their Office 365 permission. And so, and I'm hearing you say we've got to bring all of these softwares together. I'm sure you're asked about the safety, making sure the data is protected. I mean, because just I've been on just a few phone calls with and Zoom calls with some IT teams, and they're very they want to be hands-on and making sure they understand every single line about what does this connection mean. So I'm sure you all have put hours and days and months into making sure the data is safe. But I mean, anything on that front that you want to talk about your the data you all combine? Is it how safe is it?
Yeah. So we go above and beyond when it comes to data safety. We're a HIPAA compliant company. Even though we don't really process any healthcare data, our business has been mainly financial and operational data. We knew eventually we might be asked to handle healthcare data. So from the beginning, we said, let's be HIPAA compliant. When it comes to data security, we built the whole platform in Google Cloud. And so we have said, we're rather than oftentimes in IT, when you get in trouble is by trying to like roll your own solution rather than relying on the best of breed in the industry. And so for us, we looked at what Google and other companies were doing when it came to user authentication, security, logging. And we said, let's adopt what they're using rather than trying to build our own solution. So we've been very rigorous about this from the beginning because we know that, for our customers, they're handing over some of their most sensitive information. Like we handle people's payroll data, right? We know how much your employees are getting paid. That's super important to handle well, and we take that very seriously.
So one thing we want to talk about, and I want to make sure we've got plenty of time to cover this, is when we first started talking about you coming onto the podcast. I thought you had a great title for what we could talk about: 5 KPIs every C-suite should know. I don't know if that's going to be the title of your book or the title of one of the chapters of the book, but I mean, I think this is a great topic to talk about on this podcast. So if you're okay with it, let's go ahead and just dive into that. 5 KPIs that every C-suite should know. And the first one you have listed is NOI. So talk a little bit about that one.
Yeah. So I'm going to give a little bit of a shout out to Katie Meyer from Renew REIT, who helped me think about this concept. But she was teaching me that as an owner, she helps to evaluate communities by kind of going through a decision tree where the starting point is NOI or net operating income. So is this community profitable? And as an operator, as an owner, ultimately, that's your goal, right? It's profitability and delivering a good product. And so you start there. And that, again, if you're running a portfolio of kind of 40 to 50 communities or any size, it's often helpful to stack rank properties there. But that's the starting point is as a business, are we succeeding? Are we profitable?
All right. So number two, you've listed revenue.
Yeah, so I can kind of talk through like how the decision tree goes, and you can kind of
Yep.
think of it as one of those like choose your own adventure books. So if your NOI is positive, that community is performing, you may want to keep that in a good place. So if it's not NOI positive, the first place that we would suggest looking is revenue. And within revenue for senior living, there's different types, right? You have care revenue as well as rent. And we'll look at rent specifically. And underneath that, there's two things that I would encourage you to look at. So diving a little bit deeper into this, there's average daily occupancy. So how many units are rented? And then there's your actual average daily rate. And so the two of those kind of work as a seesaw of if you charge a higher rate, you may have lower occupancy to achieve the same revenue. Whereas if you have higher occupancy, but you got there by discounting heavily, you may not have the revenue that you want. And this is one of those challenges that requires having context to be able to answer if you're an operator, because particularly coming out of COVID in the last few years, there were a lot of, and you probably get this a lot, Luke, like everybody wanted to rebuild occupancy, but the question was, how do you rebuild occupancy responsibly? And if you discounted all of your units, you're creating a problem where your revenue is not going to be where you want, but you're also creating a problem for your customer, the resident, because if you're starting them, here, but you say, I can only run this building at the quality that I want to if they're paying here, how do you get them from here to here in a reasonable amount of time? Like you're baking in a real business challenge for yourself. So on the revenue side, those are the two things I would encourage you to look at: your average daily occupancy and your actual average daily rate, which is not what you wanted to charge, it's what you're actually charging.
So, I mean, kind of on that line of average daily census, everyone would agree, right? 100% is where you want to be, 100%, even with like a wait list of people. But from everything you've looked at, because I've seen some like sales training guides, and they'll give different, 100% is best, but we're happy if you're at least at, 90%, 95%. Is there a certain percentage you think from everything you've seen that, if you could say 9 out of 10 times, if your community is at least at this percentage occupancy, revenue wise, things look pretty good? Or is it just, it really depends on the building and the rent and the levels of care offered?
So this is where I'm going to be a little bit of a non-answer for two reasons. The first one is senior living is complicated, and I think that there's often a tendency when it comes to data to say, hey, can you give me a benchmark? And can you kind of lump together like all of these buildings into the same place? So I'll talk about that a little bit. The other piece is we don't do any kind of benchmarking or industry metrics across our customer data. So I can't talk about what I'm seeing in terms of our customer data set. What I will say is it really depends on the building and like, what are you trying to accomplish? So if a building is just opened and it's in lease up mode, you may be satisfied with 30% occupancy because it was at 0% a month ago. If a building historically was at 100% occupancy, but then maybe you change sales directors or you change EDs and now it's at 70%, that's underperforming. And so context is super important. And this is part of our process is I think about like one of the goals of data is to be able to answer the question, am I doing a good job? And so there's a couple different ways that we help our customers get to that. We look at stack ranking properties versus each other within your portfolio. So who are your best performers? We also look at historical trends and actuals versus budgets. So to kind of go into this example, if you were saying, what is an occupancy percentage that is quote unquote good? What I would say is, did you beat your budget? Like, are you doing better than you wanted to do? Are you doing better than you were 6 months ago or 3 months ago? Are you trending in the right direction? And how are you doing relative to your peers? Like relative to other buildings that have the same care levels, that have the same demographic population, that are apples to apples as close as you could get. And I would encourage you to think about it that way rather than saying like 90% occupancy or whatever it is the answer for every building.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. So number one we talked about was NOI, number two was revenue, and number three is expenses. So Paul, talk to us a little bit about the expenses KPI.
Yeah, so expenses you can break out in a lot of different ways. And the place we encourage everyone to start is labor. So labor is typically 60% plus of your total expenses. It's also an area where you have the most control of it. And again, underneath labor, I would look at agency and overtime. So staffing costs being the most challenging. Here's a really good data example. You can track your full-time payroll expenses via your payroll system. But agency expenses, that might be like an invoice that you pay or a swipe on a credit card, but you don't actually know sometimes what you're getting for the dollars because the agency expense will be a line item in your GL code, whereas your payroll system has the hours that are worked and the hourly rate. So it's difficult to compare those two without actually being able to see how many hours am I getting of agency staffing for the price that I paid. So that's something that we've seen customers do creative things and we've worked with them on is like, how do you unpack agency to understand how much you're actually spending? And is it a number that you're comfortable with?
One thing we've thought about, as we help our partners hire is trying to determine, well, I'll say this so on the marketing side, it's a little bit easier to say, hey, you pay us this amount and, our tools, bring in a lead and they move into the community and now you're getting X return. We've got some different things we're working on to help us kind of find that same similar formula on our recruiting and hiring tool. But how would you say companies can look at, hey, I'm trying to hire a frontline caregiver dietary position. How do I measure like how much revenue this person can actually bring in rather than just like I know I need to have them. I'm getting complaints that we're understaffed, and so I'm just hiring them and hope that solves the problem. Is there a way to figure out like, this caregiver brings in X revenue a year, this dietary position, this housekeeper? Do you see what I'm asking? Does that make sense?
It does a little bit. I mean, you could do things where like you divide the revenue numbers by staffing to get a ratio. I think the way, and this kind of leads into like the last KPI that I would encourage people to think about. Staffing is in some ways like sales, right? Like you have a funnel of applicants, you acquire a customer, you hire an employee, and you try and retain them for a certain amount of time. And I think we all agree that it's a lot easier to retain your existing customers rather than going out and like acquiring new customers all the time. And so when it comes to staffing, rather than trying to say how much revenue each person is generating, I think there's a real cost in terms of turnover that we need to be looking at. And it's not even quantifiable in terms of dollars. There's obviously the time cost of like training people, recruiting them, interviewing them. But there's also the cultural cost of having a community where there's a high degree of turnover. So the last KPI, and sorry if I'm jumping ahead of you, this is
No,
probably
please.
the
Yeah.
KPI that I spend more time talking about in 2023 than any other one, is the percentage of frontline staff that stay with you longer than 90 days. So rather than looking at turnover, we look at retention. I mean, we could look at both, but I think retention is more interesting. And the reason it's more interesting is those are the people who chose to stay. And it's kind of a starting point to follow-up analyses of like, if you have communities or regions that particularly excel at staff retention, at frontline staff retention, I would encourage you to go out and try and figure out why. And that may be more qualitative. It may be that you have a great executive director who they all love working for. It may be that you pay more than other options in the area. It may be that they really like working there, or the staffing levels are higher, and so the work is a little bit easier. But I would encourage you to try and figure out why, and then see if you could apply that to other communities. Because rather than thinking about it as revenue per employee, I would think about it as how do you maximize the group that you have to build the best culture, but also to reduce the cost of turnover and having to replace folks who decide to leave.
Yeah. I mean, culture is huge. When we had um a podcast we had a couple of weeks ago, we talked about, you know, these senior living companies focus so heavily on throwing all of these advertising dollars at Indeed. And I mean, yeah, you got to spend money to get more applicants. Totally get that. But then at the same time, we're not seeing as much money thrown on the, okay, let's make sure these employees really like working here, so we don't have
Yeah.
to keep throwing dollars at Indeed.
Well, it's the same thing as sales. It's like sometimes there is a gap, and we talk about this a lot. It's like there's a gap between customer acquisition and customer retention, to use the like business terms. Um, it's a lot of work to get someone to move into your community, particularly if you're using a third party referral or you're paying a placement fee or something like that. And so it's the same thing on staffing. It's like if you spend a ton of money advertising open positions and holding career fairs, but everybody leaves after 90 days, like, are you really being successful? And that's where you could look at one KPI that's like, how many open positions did I fill this month? And you might be doing an amazing job filling open positions, but if everybody then quits, like that number shouldn't be high forever. The number of open positions filled, it should go down because there should be fewer open positions. And so that's where, if there's data can be misleading if you look at it the wrong way. Like you could stack rank communities again by how many open positions they filled in the last 6 months, but you might want to reward the communities that filled fewer open positions but retained a higher percentage of their employees, because those are the ones that are actually maximizing what they're getting out of their team.
Yeah, that's really good. I really like that a lot. So we've talked about NOI, revenue, expenses, culture, and then I know you mentioned this, but did you give the percentage number on this last one, the frontline staff retention after 90 days? I may
Again,
have missed it. I'm not sure.
I don't have a hard percentage to share. There are other
Okay.
companies that have done more benchmarking. I think in our industry, 60-70% is exceptional. Higher than that is really strong. It's so variable. And there are some communities that are doing a great job and other places that could dig in a little bit deeper.
Yeah. No, I mean, but even thinking about, someone that you hire, a caregiver you hire, there's a 40-30% chance they're gone in the next 90 days. I mean, even the fact that like that's, 20% or 80% would be exceptional is still just as it's shocking.
Yeah.
But I mean, like you said, I think culture, you've got to start, senior living communities really need to start digging into how do I make my cultures better, not, how can I throw more money at Indeed.
And this is where it gets really fun. Like I was on a great conversation the other day where an executive asked me, like, what is one KPI I could use to measure culture? Like culture is this abstract thing. How can I measure, are we being successful? Are we not? And that was the KPI that I suggested: frontline staff retention after 90 days.
Hmm.
We have another one actually. So we have a lady on our team, our director of customer success, Trudy Croxton, who was an executive director for 10 years at Kisco and Sunrise. And she had a really interesting one where we measure not only frontline staff retention, but we also measure leadership retention. And so we work with our customers to say, what roles would you define to be leadership roles? Typically department heads, executive directors, RDOs, home office. And we hold them to a higher standard where we say, what percentage of those folks stayed for more than a year? The
Hmm.
theory being tenured leadership leads to more stable working environments, more experience, and translates to higher frontline staff retention. So it's interesting to be able to look at those two side by side for a given set of communities.
Whenever you write this book, I'm requesting a signed copy because this is gonna be really good stuff.
Yeah.
I'm excited for that to come out. I mean, even to help the C-suite like really connect some of these dots, I think it's just huge. So if someone's listening to this thinking, I need to get a much clearer picture of my data, how would they get in touch with you and with Clarent?
Yeah. So I would say reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. I post a weekly series where we deep dive into metrics. Please also check out our brand new website at clarentdata.com. We also have the deep dives in even more detail, if possible, on the website there. And happy to set up some time, talk to you about your systems, walk through our KPI library, show you some example reports, talk about what other operators are doing to be successful.
Awesome. Paul, thank you so much for coming onto this podcast. This was extremely helpful for me, and I know it will be for the listeners too.
Awesome. Thank you, Luke. I appreciate being here, and thanks for your time.